Welcome everyone to the Academy of the Impossible and our campaign school. All the people here are pretty much our hardcore students who come to almost every campaign school session we have. And we're lucky tonight to have a good buddy of mine, Adrian Montgomery, who for someone under 40 has to be one of the more experienced and seasoned political activists, maybe isn't the right word, political professional, because I mean you've done it for so long and have such a breadth of experience. And that's the primary reason. But Adrian also is, like all of us, a real student of politics, fan of politics, and he's been having front row seats for some of the presidential debates so far. So I suspect we'll all get into kind of an analysis of what's happening in the States and why it's so exciting compared to Canadian politics and why it does tend to attract us. I usually like to start these interviews, as you know, by really looking at how people became political, what it is that got them involved. So I'm curious in your case. I mean, I suspect you've been involved in politics since you were really quite young. Can you maybe tell us a bit about, your first campaign experience, your first time when you remember talking about politics in either electoral or just an issue sense?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the great impetuses for me to get involved in politics was not being very athletically inclined in high school. So I had to seek my entertainment elsewhere. And what happened was, it was 1993, it was my last year of high school, and Prime Minister Mulroney had resigned, and Jean Charest was running against Kim Campbell for the leadership of the Conservative Party. And it had the added significance that the leader of the party would effectively become the prime minister. And my mother is a Italian Catholic from the streets of Montreal, which means she's a liberal. Mm-hmm. And at that point in my life, I didn't really agree with anything that my mother had to say, so I gravitated towards the Conservative Party. It's funny, when you ask people how they got involved, a lot of them have, they don't have this great ideological, in the beginning. It's one of these kind of series of occurrences. Anyway, I literally knew nobody, and I was just mesmerized by Charest. Mm-hmm. And I had all this advice from people saying, look, if you really want to get involved in politics, Kim Campbell's going to win. She's going to cream this tortoise, as he was nicknamed by the press. But there was something about him. He was young and charismatic, and he was Quebecer and bilingual, and he was the underdog. So I drove to Ottawa, and I showed up, and I just said, I want to help this guy. And they stuck me in the warehouse where you stapled all the signs. And I never saw the inside of the convention floor. And it was still the greatest weekend of my life at that point. And I got completely caught up in the drama of a delegated convention, which is, it's trench warfare. Like they don't have delegated conventions to the same degree anymore, but it was just so exciting. And Charest ran this incredible campaign, and he mesmerized the convention, and he almost won. And so that's what happened. And then I was fortunate enough to come to work for Jean. But that's literally the series of events of how I got involved.
Well, it's interesting how you describe working in the warehouse as a part of an exciting event, because I think what often turns off, especially young people, is the fact that you do kind of have to pay your dues, that there are a lot of thankless tasks. So I'm curious how the connection between doing a lot of that grunt work and still swimming in the politics makes it exciting and makes it appealing for people who naturally have to go through those sort of hoops before you get the more exciting opportunities.
Yeah, the one thing I always say to people, and I think it is, and people don't really realize this who aren't involved in politics, but by far, the thing about politics that most people don't know is that the greatest currency you can have to get ahead in politics is not intelligence, it's not ambition, it's loyalty. Mm-hmm. And in politics, the funny thing is that you measure your own worth by the smaller the meeting, the smaller the number of people around the table, the more important you are. So you spend most of your political career wondering why you weren't invited to meetings and how you can get invited to them. Mm-hmm. Because the smaller the group, the more powerful and influential you are. And so a lot of people get involved in politics and they say, I'm great at communications, I'm great at strategy, and people who've been around a long time look at you and say, listen, man, stuffed envelopes, until you've knocked on doors, until you've been told to leave front lawns, and you've really shown that you're in the fight, you ain't getting to do strategy. You know, people always think about James Carville and George Stephanopoulos and these brilliant wonderkins behind Clinton, but they got involved with Bill Clinton when he was a nobody hick governor from Arkansas who had no chance of winning against a president who had 90% approval ratings. They proved their loyalty to him. Everyone at the time was saying, well, Clinton's got no shot. So of course he took on these young, unproven, untested guys. They proved their loyalty to him. They grew with him. And now they're these political rock stars. But they didn't start out as rock stars. They started out by picking the guy that no one thought would win, working their ass off, and that's why they're the legends they are today. So it's all about loyalty in politics, and you get that loyalty by working in the warehouses.
Well, and inversely, it strikes me that the other side of loyalty is trust, and the way in which a candidate almost earns that trust, both in terms of the people who work for them, but also voters. And sort of one of the things, certainly in the media, you keep hearing is the role of social media. But everyone who comes in talks about the human connection and talks about the way in which both the candidate with the campaign workers and the candidate with the voters, it's very much a handshake issue rather than a follow or a friend issue, let's say with Twitter or Facebook. And it sounds like you're describing something similar, that it's the personal relationship you develop both with fellow campaign workers and with the candidate that allows for that loyalty and allows for that stronger and more engaged relationship.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think, a couple points on that. One is more a commentary on social media, in that people see the success of social media phenomenon like the Barack Obama campaign in 2008, and they assume that, why didn't John McCain have a similar success? Why didn't he exploit social media? And the simple answer, and I know this is how you apply your trade, but the simple answer, and I think you'd agree with me, is because John McCain is not Barack Obama. You could own every distribution. You could own the movie house and the Blockbuster Video and the Netflix franchise for a particular movie. But if the movie's shit, no one's going to watch it. And so, that's one commentary in terms of they have to make that connection to people before they can exploit the social media and the distribution channels that really make up the grassroots campaigns in many cities. They have to make that connection. And the other comment I would make is that, whenever you meet friends who say, oh, geez, I was on the streets of Toronto and I met Brian Mulroney, or I met Jean Chrétien, or I met, Bill Clinton. It's funny that the commentary is always the same. What were they like? And people always say, when you talk to Jean Chrétien, when you talk to Bill Clinton, it's like you're the only person in the world, right? It's the universal theme for people describing their encounters with these people. And guess what? That's why they ran countries, because they make that connection with people, and they make that connection with their loyal group of activists. You meet Clintonites or you meet Mulrooney'ites, these guys would take a bullet, even today, for their boss. And they still call them the boss, right? You talk to guys who worked for Mulroney, you had Bill Fox in here. He'll say, I talked to the boss the other day. That's the connection. So personal connections are paramount.
And I'm absolutely curious to hear about some of the leaders and some of the campaigns you've worked on. But first, I'm kind of curious to hear about the different tasks and the different roles that you played in campaigns over the years. You described sort of starting out in the warehouse, stapling signs. What are some of the other things that you've done sort of over the years that have rounded out your campaign experience?
I've been a senior advisor at all levels, which means that I've traveled with candidates. You see their campaign buses. There's always 2 or 3 advisors in the back that are the last point and the first point of contact with leaders before they talk to the media. That are helping shape the media message, that are helping shape the strategy of the campaign. So I've been at the top level as a strategist for campaigns, and I've been the communications director for campaigns. I've run tour operations for campaigns and navigated the logistics and the imagery of campaigns, which is so important. and everything down to when I was a young guy, I used to take a SWAT team of workers that would go to priority ridings, and we'd knock on doors and we'd put up signs. So I've done really everything.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, does that give you a kind of rounded sense of what's necessary for a successful campaign, and I guess conversely the symptoms of a failing campaign, that you must have been in so many that beyond just a sixth sense, there are probably a lot of sort of symptoms or signals that you're in a position to read based on that experience?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the sad thing is like with anything in life, you learn far more from losing than you do from winning. I think, the one comment I would make, though, which I think often gets lost in the shuffle, is that I really do, this is my opinion, but I really do believe that politics is like running a professional sports team, in the sense that there's all kinds of things that you can do right or wrong. But if you're the CEO of the Toronto Maple Leafs, the most important factors that will determine your success are beyond your control. Mm-hmm. And politics is the same way, in the sense that the conditions that are required for a winning campaign are in many ways beyond the control. It's a function of time. It's a function of how long the other guy's been in the job. It's a function of the economy. It's a function of all kinds of things. So I'd start off by saying that a lot of the factors you can't control in a campaign. You can't control, people attaching to a certain issue that you didn't see in any polling. But having said that, I've seen winning campaigns and I've seen losing campaigns, and I've played senior roles in both, a few more losing than winning, which means I'm a great source of information on what not to do. But yeah, I mean, there's a culture and a vibe to a winning campaign that just is not there for a losing campaign.
Mm-hmm. And of course, as a Tory who lives in Toronto, mm-hmm. obviously in Toronto itself, the Tories don't do it very well. I mean, you've been involved in both provincial and federal campaigns where the Tories have done well.
Sure.
I'm curious, actually, that you bring up the municipal. Why don't we start there? Do you have any good anecdotes of some of the municipal campaigns you've run, both successful?
Yeah, John Tory's campaign, when he ran for mayor in 2003, I ran his campaign. And that was one where we started at, believe it or not, at 3% in the polls. He was running sixth in a 5-person race because they used to put Julian Fantino's name in the poll, and he wasn't even running. We polled behind him. So we went from 3.5% to almost 40, one of the closest, if not the closest election in mayoralty history. And, I think for me, in many ways, a Toronto mayoralty campaign could be one of the most fascinating political experiences for a bunch of reasons. One, there's no parties. So you have, on John's campaign as an example, you had liberals and conservatives, even some new Democrats working together. And you got to find, as a partisan, their tricks of the trade and what they did, because you're always going head-to-head with them up a level, and you really start, Warren Kinsella, who's the famous Prince of Darkness, as he calls himself, and is the hatchet man for the Liberal Party, has a blog, and he's on TV and all that kind of stuff. I mean, he was evil personified for me. And then I ended up working with him on John's mayoralty campaign. It was phenomenal, actually. We become good friends. So there's no party affiliation, which is great. Number two is municipal politics touches people's lives more than any other level of government. So you're really down and dirty in terms of what matters to people. And the third thing is, this is one of the most diverse cities, as we all know. And so trying to run a political campaign when you've got so many ethnic groups, so many socioeconomic classes, so many different, suburban versus urban, downtown versus the burbs, it really requires some intellectual gymnastics to figure out where are my votes. So it's really phenomenal. I mean, we were really proud of John's campaign. David Miller came out of nowhere as well, and he won that campaign, but we fought him all the way, and it was people were interested,
Well, I'm curious then to hear about John's provincial campaign, which I think you sort of alluded to in terms of an issue that no one really saw before the election, and then faith-based funding really came to dominate that campaign.
Right.
I mean, what was that like in terms of...
It was hell.
Yeah.
It was absolute unmitigated hell. And to go through faith-based, I think faith-based funding and how it came to be is one of the more misunderstood.
It was a very intellectual idea.
It was a very intellectual idea, and you have to take a step back. Like everyone always asks me when I go to dinner parties and people found out that I piloted John Tory's career into the ground. They always, we're still good friends, by the way. I saw him today at. In any event, they always ask me, like, what was he thinking?
Yeah.
Right? And that's point number one. So to diagram that out for you, first of all, no leader can get a policy, let alone a policy like that, through to their party's platform by themselves. They always say success has 1,000 fathers and failure is an orphan. It's true, because the faith-based funding came up when John ran for leader against Jim Flaherty in 2004. And there were pockets of votes in Eastern Ontario where people were really concerned. They had school vouchers that Flaherty had put in as finance minister. They wanted to keep them. And it became this issue that Flaherty used in the leadership to say John's not a real conservative because he's not supporting this. So John really endorsed that idea because of the heat of the politics of the leadership. Mm-hmm. And
sort of to bring the party together and show that he was sort of giving an amends to the losing side in the leadership.
Correct. And that's one of the issues that I think conservatives have and Republicans have in the States, in that it's harder to win the Republican presidential nomination than win the general election, because you have so many of these Tea Party factions and evangelical factions and all these different groups that need to make sure that you're the red meat conservative, that you build that coalition in your own party. Then you go out to the general election and people are saying, what the fuck is that all about, right? Mm-hmm. And it's really difficult. And so John did that. Then it got passed through many policy conventions until it became part of the platform. So John did not do that by himself. And he's a very, very, he's got a lot of integrity, and he's a guy who came to see it as an issue of fairness. The Catholics get taxpayer funding. Why don't other religious groups get taxpayer funding? And it was rooted in an issue of fairness. Mm-hmm. Where we made a mistake, just purely tactically, is we did a policy announcement on like the second day of the campaign at a Jewish school, and we put that policy in the window, right? In politics, you can embrace less than popular platforms, but don't put them in the window. Mm-hmm. And John felt we had to put it in the window. We went to this Jewish school, and when he was being scrummed in the media after, we started not having answers to questions, where it was people saying, well, geez, like what if a certain school teaches creationism as opposed to evolution? What do you do then, John? And like, to be honest, hello YouTube, we didn't really think that. Not that we didn't think it through. Well, I guess we didn't think it through, to be honest with you. And then,
and in his defense, it's a pretty substantial policy idea,
right? That
shows a lot of leadership to put forward, and I think almost makes sense that we haven't thought about all the implications, because it's pretty major. And if I sort of read your kind of criticism after the fact, that it was too big to put out there, that if anything, it should have been either left later in the campaign or not so prominent, because it is meant for Parliament, not a campaign, right, in terms of how it should be debated and fleshed out.
Right. I mean, Mitt Romney is pro-life. Mitt Romney is not making his pro-life stance a centerpiece of his campaign. He's talking about the economy. He's talking about certain foreign policy ideas. We made it, a centerpiece for our campaign. And the other thing that we did that was just absolutely asinine, and I completely blame John for this, is and I do, John, is one of the things that, and I'm sure we'll get into it, is one of the things that you have to do in a winning campaign is you have to be disciplined on your message. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people who aren't involved in politics, like my father, for example, will say, why doesn't he answer the question? Why is he committing this thing to a study? We don't need studies, enough studies. Why is he, going here? Why is he not taking this issue head on? The reality of the situation is that, and there's a point at which I agree with my father and people like that. But at the same time, if you answer any question that's asked to you, you've basically ceded all control to the questioner, right? So if I said, when did you stop, beating your girlfriend, right? Like that's the kind of I didn't beat. What do you mean? Like you're ceding too much control to your questioner, and so successful campaigns are ones that are disciplined on message. And one of the ways you can become undisciplined on message, and this is like the classic fight on a campaign that Fox probably told you about, is you can't be too accessible to the media, because which is why on a like when Stephen Harper runs a campaign or when Jean Chrétien ran a campaign, this is the winning formula. It doesn't always win, but this is the formula. You go out early, you make a policy announcement. Today I'm going to talk about a tax credit for first-time home buyers. And that's what you want your message to be. Your polling says, the middle-class voters in these suburban ridings that I'm targeting to win care about this issue. So you go out and you make your policy announcement. Then you do a media availability and you try like hell to answer questions about the homeowner tax credit. Then you go to a partisan crowd and you talk a little bit about it and you fire it up. Then you go downtime, you do a couple of local radio interviews, and you do a rally at night to show momentum. That's it. That's all. Mm-hmm. And that's the best way you can try to control your message. And in the old days, before social media exploded, you do your press announcement at like 10:30 in the morning to get on the noon news, and you control the cycles. Now, you see all these guys starting to do announcements at 7:30 because there is no such thing as the noon news being the first in the news cycle. All that to say, John wanted to be so accessible to the media. He did not like to say no. He didn't want to be that guy that was hiding. So we would do 2 or 3 media availabilities a day. And what happens in those situations is the media say, okay, well, if you're going to ask me, give me 3 chances to ask a question. I asked you once about the homeowner tax credit. I'm sick of that. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask you anything I damn well want right now. And then all of a sudden, you lose control of your message, and then you lose control of your campaign. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the reasons why faith-based stayed in the forefront, because what John would do is he'd say, look, I'm going to go and I'm going to knock on doors. And we would say, John, leaders don't knock on doors. Now, a lot of people, like my dad, would say, well, why don't they? Well, here's why you don't knock on doors. One, because you don't want to show up on somebody's front lawn with 45 media intel, okay? Which is what you have to do. You ruin gardens, you overturn pots, you piss people off. So some poor unsuspecting person opens the door, there's like 17 television cameras in their face, they're, 40 people in their garden, and you're like, what are you doing? The other reason you don't do it is because you can't control that. So John would literally, to his credit, have 16 out of 20 homes that he knocked on talk about taxes and the economy, but like 3 or 4 would always ask about faith-based. So then the media seized on that. Mm-hmm. So we were undisciplined because we were catering too much to, because John always wanted to be as the hardest working guy. He was obsessed with that. I'm going to do 10 events a day. I'm going to knock on 100 doors. And that's great, but that makes you lose control of your message and your campaign, which is the most important thing to win.
Well, and he seems to be both smart and savvy as a communicator, that he wanted to play the game under rules that are fair, but no one else wanted to go by those rules.
Right.
Which almost seemed the tragedy of a really good person.
Right.
Who's unwilling to kind of play the game the way the game wants it to be played.
Right. And there's 2 real interesting things to that, because the one example I always give about someone like John is if I told you that I had a friend that was the nicest man I've ever met, and he married his high school sweetheart, and he taught Sunday school, and he was a Cub Scout leader, and he was the nicest guy in the world. And I said, but whenever he plays in his men's pickup basketball league, he's known that when he's in the paint and some guy's next to him, he gives him an elbow every time. And I don't think any of you would say, well, geez, how could he be the nice man you think he is if he's elbowing people in a rec league game? Right? That's like ludicrous. Right? We all know how the two can coexist. John couldn't. You know, he couldn't elbowing people's against the rules. I can't elbow people. And so that was his outlook on life, that you couldn't be a nice man with lots of integrity and not play by the rules. And what we would always say to him is we'd use kind of examples like that and say, well, come on, man, like that's how it works. The other real interesting thing about it is what we didn't understand is the media love the cut and thrust and the punching of they love the dark arts of politics as much, if not more, than anyone. So they kind of respect you if you throw a good elbow, right? And we never, John never really kind of understood or let himself understand that part about the media. Because he'd say, oh, well, look, reporter from the Toronto Star, that guy threw me an elbow. And the media kind of, yeah, well, it was a pretty good elbow, actually. They love that as much as anybody. So that was the problem with him, and that's what happened.
And I'm curious to rewind, because I've always been fascinated with the idea of the campaign boss.
And by the way, in a Toronto Life article, he kind of blamed his advisors for his loss. So this is me getting back at telling my side of the story.
And we all know YouTube trumps Toronto Life.
Absolutely.
Now, I've always been fascinated by the campaign boss, both because it strikes me as a marathon, even though the campaign can often be as short as 4 weeks. And yet it seems like a real slog. So I'm curious maybe to go back to your first time that you rode the campaign bus.
Yeah.
And what that was like. Obviously you weren't a rookie, but a rookie in the sense that it was your first time on the bus. Tell us a bit more, both what that was like politically, but also what it was like personally. I mean, I'm sure getting very little sleep, very good food. I mean, what might you offer as words of caution to someone who might be willing to offer themselves in a similar way?
Yeah, I think the being on a campaign bus is like being, head roadie on a U2 tour, right? Like it's really exciting. I mean, you're traveling constantly with hordes of media. You're in the eye of the storm. Everything you do is on the nightly news and in the newspaper. So you see direct impacts on what you do immediately. And you feel like you're in the center of the universe. And everyone's talking about it, and you're there. And when you show up, especially when you're with prime ministers and stuff like that, you've got the entourages and motorcades and bodyguards and it really is cool. I learned the hard way, though, on my first campaign that the bodyguards in the RCMP are paid to protect the Prime Minister. They're not necessarily paid to protect you. So, I was sort of seeing this phalanx around Mulrooney, and then I just kept getting hit in the head with protest signs and got stitches. But so that's one word of caution. It's you don't sleep. You work 24 hours a day. It's high adrenaline, but you know what? It's the greatest thing in the world. It's the greatest thing in the world. And the only thing that took me time to learn is you were always afraid when you were on a campaign, especially as a young person, that something you would do or say would in any way detract from the campaign or wind up in the newspaper. And so it's really interesting how as you get more senior and more involved as a strategist in politics, how your relationship with the media changes. Because in the beginning, you assume, because you have this assumption that the media are out to kind of get you. And so, some reporter would come up to you and say, here's a young guy who's clearly on the leader's bus. So, what'd you think of that? And you're like, okay, what are my talking points? And you'd be very wooden. And then you'd see over time that those reporters would stop talking to you because they're not out to get you. They're out to trade information as currency. And so that took a while to get used to. And the greatest reporters will never burn you because they know they burn you once, they can never use you again. And so over time, you develop that bartering of information. So you'd leak something to the press. And as a young guy, you're scared to death to do that. but over time you'll learn how to do it, and it's pretty cool and it's pretty fun.
And I'm curious too, and you know, both on a personal level, but I think quite relevant to those in the room. I mean, do you remember the point where you went from being a volunteer to a staffer? When you had sort of gotten to the point that, you know, rather than just be the key young person, you were the future, you know, the future talent, the people that they really wanted to bring in close. Do you remember when that happened? When you sort of felt, hey, they're really taking me seriously and they're paying me. This is a real, you know, and that's obviously when you really come alive and feel that this is for you.
Yeah, you know, I do remember when that happened, because I was always involved as a volunteer, and I was involved in youth politics as well. And what happened was, in 1995, Mike Harris was running for premier. That's when he won, but he was a nobody, and he was not expected to win. Lynn McLeod, who ran the Liberal leadership, was expected to win. And what happened was the Toronto Star had sponsored a debate before the campaign happened. And the Liberals had gotten tipped off by somebody, who knows, but say there were 500 tickets to this debate, the Liberals had gotten, you know, 290 of them or something like that. And so the party phoned me because they had heard that I was this young guy that was, you know, I could get people to show up at stuff. And so the party said to me, they said, look, we're going to get absolutely embarrassed at this debate. Here's 120 tickets. You have to make sure that when the cameras come on, these are the only 120 people you see. We'll give you buses, we'll give you food, we'll give you money, we'll give you anything. You get those 120 people, and there's an art to it in politics. There's no such thing as a spontaneous crowd in politics, right? There's camera angles, and so you make that 120 look like Mike Harris is the only guy in the room that matters. And I was like, holy shit. And so I literally got 120 tickets, and I got school buses and money, and my friend at the time helped me do this, and we literally load people on at high schools, and we put them in that room, and we rocked the joint. And Harris, that was his first real appearance on the provincial stage, and he was so buoyed, and we were in this kind of post-debate party for the Conservatives, and he walked in, and back then, you know, these candidates and leaders are like gods, right? Like, you're like, wow. And he walked up, and he said, and everyone cheered him, great job, and there was like 500 Conservatives in the room, and he said, I just have one question. He said, where the hell is Adrian Montgomery?
Nice.
And I was in the back of the room going, what? And he pulled me up on stage, and everyone cheered, and that was the moment, right? That I was given this big challenge and made it happen, and I'll never forget that for sure.
Right on. And it kind of, I mean, Mike Harris kind of evokes something that Bill Fox has often told me about, which is how, you know, the Conservatives are really the party of Main Street and not Bay Street. And I think part of the reasons that Harris was such a surprise win was because through the Common Sense Revolution, he really did appeal to a very broad swath of Ontario. And you've obviously had an opportunity to work with a bunch of different Tory leaders. So I'm curious whether in the case of Harris or whether in others, if you've identified this kind of populist streak that, you know, a really successful Tory candidate is often one who, A, earns the respect of the business community, but also earns the respect of people like your dad, who, you know, see themselves as really down to earth, smart, but nonetheless, they're not into the hoity-toity stuff. They're, you know, sort of, they want an honest kind of politician. And a lot of Tories have been successful at kind of embodying that. I'm curious, as a communications guy, as a strategist guy, you know, what you feel about the Harris sort of as one architect or others who are successful at doing that, who are successful at really articulating that kind of Main Street sort of position and identity.
Yeah, I think that is the recipe for success for Conservative politicians, particularly in Ontario and in Canada. It's connecting with that middle class suburban voter, and some people obviously do it better than others. I think one of the mistakes we made in 2007, not to pile on my good friend John, is that we didn't really, if you remember that campaign, and there was so much noise around faith-based funding, I don't think we talked about the middle class in that campaign. I remember in 1995, and I, you know, Mike Harris evokes many thoughts and images in people's minds, but I'll never forget, I was a young guy and I took a SWAT team of young people across the province. We went from riding to riding, and we just did Joe jobs, but we'd go to priority ridings and give them a boost of manpower.
Mm-hmm.
And what we would do is we would go from door to door all over the province. And what I will never forget is, to this day, and I've been involved in so many campaigns, that was the easiest campaign platform as a 21-year-old to explain to people across the province. It was cutting your taxes. It was work for welfare. Why should someone get a welfare check without work? I'm not arguing for it. I'm just telling you.
But it's clear communication.
And it was, get rid of Bob Ray and all this kind of stuff. And what we used to do on the campaign, I was the leader of this SWAT team, is I always used to say, okay, who gets the most lawn signs, gets the free beer at the bar, and we'd have these competitions to get lawn signs. And I remember I was down by one sign, and I was in like Goderich, Ontario, or something like that, and it was getting dark, and you had to kind of shut it down. And there were these guys in a garage that were drinking beer, and they were clearly affiliated with some sort of biker gang, okay, and full patches and everything. And this is my problem as a competitive guy. I'm like, I should not go in there, but I'm down a sign, and I can't afford to buy the beer. So I go creeping up the driveway, and this guy looks at me and goes, "What the fuck are you doing? Get off my property!" Right? And I'm like, "Yeah, sorry, sir." And I'm walking away. And I don't know what possessed me to do it. And I turned around and I said, I'm just trying to get you to vote Conservative, but if you want to vote for the guy who's gonna give people welfare checks for doing nothing, that's your prerogative. And then I kind of started to run. And he was like, hey, get back here. And I walked back and he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, Mike Harris is running. He's work for welfare. He goes, Yeah. Well, why wouldn't they work for what? Yeah. Well, what do you want? And I said, I'd love to put a sign on your line. He said, put a sign on the line. And, I was like, yeah. But it was just like and Tom Long, who was the chairman of Mike's campaign, always said, guys, this is going to be. He had this romantic notion. This is going to be fought over backyard fences and at picnic tables. And it's going to be hand-to-hand combat in suburbia, and it was. But it was like the policies resonated with these people. Now, the flip side of that, the funny thing, sorry, this has nothing to do with anything, but I was so convinced I was the greatest sign getter in the world. I was in Sudbury, which, Conservatives shouldn't even bother going to Sudbury, but I went to Sudbury, and we had the former police chief, Richard Zanaby, who was running for Mike. And so they sent us to this shit part of town, right? And so I knocked on the door at like 10 o'clock in the morning, and there was no answer, and all of a sudden the door opened, and this woman was squinting at the sunlight clearly. I had a big night, and I'd woken her up. She said, what do you want? And I said, and I was like the young keener. I said, well, ma'am, I'm canvassing on behalf of Richard Zanaby. He's your Mike Harris candidate. We had the canned speech. She said, Zanaby? Isn't that the former police chief? And I said, and I was like, name recognition. Yeah. I'm like, yeah. And I'm like, yeah. And she pauses and she goes, and like some like Doberman or something came to the door right out of the move. She goes, that son of a bitch put my husband in prison. You get the fuck off my lawn. And like the Doberman started running out. I was like, ah. So, the campaign worster. That time it didn't work. I didn't talk about our law and order agenda with her. I'll never forget that. That son of a bitch put my husband in prison.
It's interesting though how you talk about how clear communication, especially for those frontline volunteers and workers, is so important. In a hypothetical scenario, but if you want to turn it into a real scenario,
sure.
Do you ever have people come to you and ask for advice and say, hey Adrian, we've been buds in the party for a long time. I'm thinking of running. What do you say? What kind of advice do you have? Do you ever A, tell people, forget about it, buddy, you've got no chance? Or B, what would be the type of kind of abridged over a beer advice that you'd give to an aspiring candidate?
It's funny, having grown up in politics and in the party and being in my late 30s now is the time when a lot of my friends are
getting the itch.
And some of my, it's funny, you go to you grow up with people, and now, one of my best friends that I used to run campaigns with, John Baird, is the foreign affairs minister, and Tony Clement's the industry minister, and these guys are running the country, which is kind of cool. But I'm hard pressed to ever advise someone who's really into it not to run for public office, because I don't think enough good, caring people, regardless of your party affiliation, want to run anymore. And I really feel passionately about that. But it's very tough for me to advise that when I don't do it myself, because it's a sacrifice to run. It's a sacrifice on many levels. But my friends who are politically active, I tend to encourage them. The only thing that I have to be candid about is one of the other things about politics that a lot of people don't realize is you almost need to lose to become a winner. And a lot of people aren't prepared to do that. You can't think of a politician. Brian Mulroney ran for leader and lost before he won. Bill Clinton lost as governor of Arkansas. George Bush lost a congressional seat in Texas. Barack Obama has lost. You have to lose before you can win. And so a lot of people don't have the stomach for that, because they can't stand the public fallout from losing. And it's almost like, running an Olympic bid, which I'm also familiar with. Losing is not a bad thing. You have to learn how to lose to win. And so I give that advice. And the other thing too is, there are certain pockets of the city or the province or the country that just they won't vote for certain parties. It's hard if your best friend is a liberal and he's from downtown Calgary, Edmonton, and says, hey, I really, my life is depending on me running as a liberal in Calgary. It's like, well, have fun. Because you ain't going to win. If you want to run as a conservative in the Beaches or in Trinity, Spadina, you're not going to win. So have fun, but you're going to be cannon fodder. So those are the types.
And on that point, do you have any sense why the Tory candidate in Trinity, Spadina runs, knowing full well that he's?
Do you know what? Well, first of all, and maybe I'm giving too many secrets. Normally, in the past, the people I've helped get to run in Trinity, Spadina is like the president of the U of T Conservatives.
Right.
So it's just like
he's just gaining experience.
He's gaining experience, and he's having fun, or she's having fun. And a lot of times, people they're crazy enough to actually enjoy being a candidate, being a mouthpiece for the party, going to the debates and stuff. But you definitely have to be like a party hack to run in an unwinnable riding. And then, God help you if there's some crazy tidal wave and you win.
Yeah, like the NDP.
Like the NDP who went to Vegas for a campaign.
Well, and I like what you're saying before about how, we do need to encourage people right across the political spectrum, the best and the brightest, to take that sacrifice, to work in politics in that way. But at the same time, they're both on a pleasurable level, but also on a professional level. There are clear rewards to making these types of sacrifices and contributing and paying your dues and working in politics. Without getting into specifics, to what extent has your professional life, which is very interesting and very successful, how much of it's been influenced by your politics? Would you have been a lawyer had you not been so engaged in politics in the first place?
Well, I'll tell you, it's a really funny. So, politics, and a lot of people who are in politics have this problem. Politics can't, in many ways, help you get a job, because what I was saying earlier about when you're on the leader's bus and you feel like you're in the center of the universe, it's a great feeling, but you actually feel you're in the center of the universe. And then you go to Bay Street or you go somewhere else and you realize that not everyone thinks that politics is the center of the universe. So you say, hey, I was an advisor to Mike Harris. And they said, well, but can you sell insurance for me? Like, who cares, right? And so it's but when you get a job, all my toolbox of politics helps me do my job. And the funny thing is, I run a private equity firm now, and we buy and sell oil and gas companies, and we get into fights all the time, proxy battles and all this kind of stuff. So when I told you when I was 21 years old that I stacked this room for Mike Harris, and I had a friend buddy who helped me. That buddy is now my lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
And we go out and travel the world and buy and sell businesses together. And everything we do, we always look at each other and laugh and go, this is what we did 20 years ago. And yeah, this is, it's like getting rid of a dissident director on your board, right? We know how to do that. We've done that in youth politics. We kicked someone off a youth executive. Like it literally, and we laugh all the time. And we literally took that political bond and we're now actually, being grown-ups and stuff. So politics is the greatest. If you care about communications, if you care about public relations, if that's what you're interested in, the absolute place to cut your teeth is politics.
Mm-hmm.
Crisis communications, right? Bill Fox will tell you that. It is, if I hire a PR person, I want to know they've been involved in politics. Because then I know they've been to the NFL of communications. That's
the kind of trial by fire.
Yeah, if someone says, hey, I've got a degree from Humber or something like that in PR, that's great. But in my biased opinion, when you're dealing with faith-based funding and the world is falling apart and you've got a pack of media jackals on you and you're trying to figure out key messages on the fly and you've got social media lighting up and you're trying to navigate a strategy through that, that is ground zero to learn.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm curious, the reason I sort of use that as a segue is you told me the other day that you got to be, I think, both at the Boca Raton debates and you said the Hofstra ones as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, why don't we segue to talk about American politics? Sure. And we'll start with the obvious. Why is it always so interesting? Why is U.S. politics always has a sex appeal that Canadian politics seems to, for the most part, always lack?
Well, I think it's a couple things. I think I would agree with you, except for Quebec. I think Quebec, politics is part of the, politics is celebrity, politics is sexy, politics is religion in Quebec. I remember, Hugh Segal, who's a senator, said that, one of the rules in politics when he worked for Robert Stanfield was if you show up in Alberta as a leader of a party, make sure you show up in a rusted pickup truck. If you show up in Montreal as a leader of a party, make sure you show up in a stretch limo. Mm-hmm. Because they want their leaders to look like leaders in Quebec. Mm-hmm. And so I would exempt Quebec from that, but otherwise I would agree with you. I think in the States, politics is celebrity, politics is religion, politics is all these things. And the one thing, for all their flaws that Americans have done, which we haven't done in Canada, is Americans have very deftly separated the office from the office holder. Mm-hmm. So you can shit on the senator from Wisconsin, and you can call him or her names, but don't dare criticize the institution of the Senate. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You can shit on the President of the United States as much as you want, but do never denigrate the institution of the presidency.
Which is an interesting juxtaposition where the individual politicians themselves, their trust factor decreases, but people still covet the office.
Right.
The office itself still remains the grand prize that everyone in the land would shoot themselves and their sister to get.
Right. And I think that is one of the brilliant things that they've done, which and what happens is that if you see a former athlete or the CEO of Hewlett Packard, a massive company, say, okay, I'm resigning and I'm going to run to be governor of a state. No one thinks twice about that. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Carly Fiorina used to run a big company and now she wants to be a senator. Yeah, that makes sense. If the CEO of Bell stepped down tomorrow and said, I want to run for the Tim Hudak Conservatives, everyone, including me, would go, why?
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Mm-hmm.
Why would you do that? Mm-hmm. Because the office has been dragged down with the office holders in this country. Mm-hmm. And quite honestly, as a conservative, I put a lot of the blame at conservatives for affecting that outcome, because in an effort to be populist and grassroots and appeal to people like my dad, what they've done is they've shit on the position So it's like, you know what? If we're your cabinet and we don't balance the budget, as they said in BC, cut our paychecks 30%. If we don't do this, voter recall legislation, kick these bums out, do this. They've dragged the office down with it.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't done that in the States, which is why it's so cool. You know, I've been to one of the great things that I used to do when I was in the entertainment industry is I was invited every year to the White House Correspondents' Dinner in Washington, which is that off the record where the president always, and you go to the White House Correspondents' Dinner and you've got Steven Spielberg, Tom Cruise, Tom Brady, the commissioner of the NFL, you know, the Victoria's Secret model, you know, the head of you know, the biggest charities. Like, you've got it's everything.
Mm-hmm.
It's Hollywood. It's this. It's that. It's really cool what they've done in the States. You know.
As a quick tangent, I mean, do you think perhaps the federal Liberal Party is making a bit of a mistake by bypassing an actual leadership contest to anoint a celebrity who has very little parliamentary experience against two other leaders who are parliamentary veterans, masters? I mean, is there any kind of, you know, as a Tory, obviously, you know, you don't have a stake in the Liberal leadership contest, but it does seem as if they're succumbing to the same kind of celebrity wow factor rather than looking at who would be the best leader or have a contest to determine who would be the best leader.
You know, I think one of the mistakes that the Conservative Party made when it was in the wilderness was to stop having these delegated conventions and to go to one member, one vote. And what happens from a very pragmatic standpoint is whether you're in power or you're not, you go from having wall-to-wall national media coverage for 3 days and seeing great theater of a delegated campaign, people crossing in from one box into the other, the drama, who's going to support who, everyone's riveted. And when you're like not in government, you can't buy that publicity. It's like it's an adrenaline and a shot in the arm that your party desperately needs. All of a sudden in the 90s, when the Conservatives were nowhere, we said, no, it's got to be more grassroots than that. Let's do one member, one vote. And then you had the party president on News World at 3 a.m. reading riding results out. Who gives a shit about that, right? So the Liberal Party really needs that theater to get people reinvigorated and say, what's the Liberal Party up to? So I'm with you. They need that contest. They need that boxing match, right? And
plus, the other benefit of a delegated convention is the more minor players can actually have a role to play in that narrative, whereas otherwise they're just dismissed. Otherwise they're just dismissed as, you know, having no chance, and you get maybe a talk about the top 2 or 3 leaders. But when you have delegates, those people, where they're going to go, they may not win, but they get profile, and that's how they become cabinet ministers, because they were the ones who helped broker different deals.
100%. And the other thing, too, about delegated conventions back in the day was, and I can only speak to the Conservative Party, but I'm pretty sure it was the same in the Liberal Party. In the constitutions of the parties, they said, okay, every riding elects 10 delegates, and that's, you know, and you'd go to these meetings, and you'd fight riding by riding, and you'd stack meetings, and you'd try and, you know, you'd go to a delegate selection meeting in Brampton or something like that, and there'd be like 1,000 people at it to elect 10 people. That was the hand-to-hand combat, and the famous stories of Mulroney running against Joe Clark, and, you know, these are certainly not confirmed stories, but they literally, both of them, would have buses, and they'd go by homeless shelters with booze. And then all of a sudden they'd have like 8,500 homeless people voting in the Conservative. Like, they would literally, you know, go to those levels to get voters out and all kinds of shit like that.
Well, when I was in university, I mean, you'd hear all the parties engaged in those types of
buses. Oh, absolutely.
I mean, it was kind of
it's very unseemly, but you know, when we voted for the U of T delegates for Jean Charest, my first involvement at the University of Toronto, we had 600 people show up to elect 10 people, and it was warfare. But the point I was making is that in the constitutions, 3 out of every 10 delegates from every riding had to be youth. So the other byproduct of these conventions is that youth started to become responsible for 30% of the vote. That's what got them into the party. That's what got them involved and excited, and
make them feel valued.
And boy, oh boy, as a youth president, was I taken seriously. I mean, you'd see prime ministers courting the youth vote because they had to. It was 30%, and you know, as a young guy, you know, it's easier to attract a bunch of people when you're young. You know, there's more loyalty. So there's so many. I lament the end of delegated conventions. I think it's so important. Certainly, there's all kinds of bullshit tactics and stuff like that are associated with it, but that's what kind
but
of
I'm sure
politics
there's
fun.
Bullshit tactics associated with the new systems.
Oh yeah,
that you know will appear in future anecdotes.
Yeah, 100%.
Now I'm curious to go back to the U.S. president debates.
Sure.
What it was like, because you almost described it as kind of Super Bowl.
Yeah, well,
I'll
tell you. The coolest thing about it, and I've been to a number of them, is you really get the feeling like you're going to a heavyweight boxing match, right? Like a title fight. That's the way you feel, and you know, you feel very privileged to be there, and you get shuttled in, and you have to clear yourself with the Secret Service and all this kind of stuff. And you go in, and then you go into what they call Spin Alley, and there are literally 5,000 accredited media for a presidential debate. It is like the Super Bowl of politics. Like, as someone who grew up in Ontario politics, Canadian politics, you go to this and you're like, this is a whole different level. And really, when you go in, they come out and they say, look, you know, 70 million people are going to be viewing this. You can't cheer, you can't do this, you can't do that. And people say, well, how do you keep yourself in check? And the thing is that all I can say is it's kind of like going to the Vatican or the Sistine Chapel. Like, you feel so awed by being there that you don't want to screw it up.
Yeah. It's almost like a sacred place.
Yeah, it really is. Like, you feel like you're part of American history. But they come, it's like a title fight. I mean, they come out, and then you go and you see all the advisors come in and start spinning the message. And it's just mayhem. It's the coolest thing I've ever done as a political observer. Do
you have any thoughts on this presidential campaign and how either candidate has fared given the expectations and constituency?
Yeah, I personally think you know, Mitt Romney was left for dead before the first debate, and I think he's really made this a horse race that it shouldn't otherwise have been. And I think he's really done a hell of a job. I think this is a guy, like I said before, his own party doesn't like him. I don't know anyone that likes him, but all of a sudden he's in a horse race. Like, he's so committed to getting his message out, and he's disciplined and he's undeterred. I think the campaign is going to come down to 4 states, which is remarkable, really, when you think about it. I mean, Iowa, Virginia, Nevada, and Ohio. And literally, the entire campaign's coming down to 4 votes. I think 4 states. I think it's going to be really close. I think Obama is probably going to win, but I think it's going to be a horse race. And you know, like I said, I run a private equity firm. My next investment is going to be, I'm going to buy radio stations in Ohio and Virginia. Because, I mean, every 2 years, they're just inundated with boatloads of money. So I'm gonna write a business plan: TV and radio stations in swing states.
I suspect Warren Buffett already kind of.
I'm sure somebody's thought of it, but I mean, it's remarkable.
I mean, you're a guy who's worked in the media as well, and sort of understands the media side of the business. Off that note, I almost get a sense that in the States there are small markets, whether in Ohio or not in Ohio, that exist only because of political advertising. That if you took out the political advertising, all the other advertisers have gone to digital or have gone elsewhere.
Oh, 100%.
I mean, to what extent is television as a medium still kind of, at least in small markets, dependent upon that type of sort of every 2-year influx of cash?
Well, I think they're totally dependent on it. You know, I think, but that's back to the point of, in the States, politics is an industry. There aren't really many volunteers in politics. I mean, everyone's a paid staffer in the States because, you know, they can afford to pay it. I mean, political consultants, the way political consultants work in the States is they get percentages of ad buys. So you have, You have political consultants in the States who are making millions and millions of dollars working on campaigns. I know several of them. And it's big business. And it's big business all the way down to those TV stations.
Wow. I could obviously continue to talk to Adrian for a long time, so I certainly take an opportunity to open it up to the floor.
Well, there was a conversation at the beginning about the natural charisma, the appeal to loyalty that is required.
Thank you, by the way.
For a candidate.
Oh, I thought you were. You were talking about me
as well. Of course.
I'm
I wasn't specifically referring to you.
That's very flattering. No, I'm teasing.
But